Okay, so this one is the one that focuses on the positive aspects of fun, if you like. And I think one of the things we need to remind ourselves constantly as teachers is that the learners experience a great deal of anxiety in the classroom, and we forget that at our peril. This is a quote from a Chinese learner of English, and he, I think, captures the anomie, if you like, of speaking a second language. When I hear my voice, I just hate it. This is his English-speaking voice. He feels his self is falling apart, and he feels disconnected from his real... It is a bit harsh, but I think, there's a lot of that kind of literature in the diary studies that have been done of learners going way back to the 1970s. And we don't often read the signs until we read what they write about their experience in the classroom. And so this is one reason alone to take affect, the emotional, the anxiety side of things very seriously. And so it's not surprising, perhaps, that given this high state of anxiety that many learners are in, the reaction is often to show the opposite, that learners tend to laugh a lot in classes, but they're laughing out of sheer terror, I would argue. This is a quote from a novel, Barbara Pym, if you remember Barbara Pym, and she's learning Portuguese, and it says, it ought to be learning something again, but there's a certain lightheartedness in the process, as if we had shed some of the intervening years since school days. We laughed inordinately at the smallest jokes, finding something amusing in the most ridiculous trifles, and when we were actually given homework, it seemed the funniest thing of all. And again, I was in a classroom relatively recently, and it was interesting how much we laughed. And it wasn't always a reaction to the tension. There was a lot of good-spirited laughter. And of course, this is rated very highly by learners, where there is a classroom where they're allowed to laugh and they're encouraged to laugh. This is from a book on positive psychology, and it's just a number of statements from learners, including this one, who's studying Italian, and she said the atmosphere is great and all members feel comfortable speaking Italian. What's more, we laugh a lot, which is, in my opinion, very important when learning the language. Fun. And another one, just for good measure, I think this is interesting because it tries to relate it to the local context. This was a study done of language classrooms in Vietnam in the 90s, and she said many of the classrooms observed in the study were punctuated by laughter. So these Vietnamese students learning English with a Vietnamese teacher. Teasing was common, whether from teachers to students, from students to teachers, or among students themselves. There was also much play with word formation. The high value placed on quick and clever oral responses and verbal volleying seen in English classes has its roots, she claims, or they claim, in traditional Vietnamese culture. I don't know. I know nothing of Vietnamese culture, but I suspect that that is not simply a local Vietnamese phenomenon. And of course, we are now familiar with the concept of the affective filter. Before we look at that, just one more quote for good measure on humor. And again, I think this emphasizes the fact that because there is this inbuilt anxiety in any educational context, but particularly learning a second language, there is a need for humor. So humor has an important place, particularly where face threats must continually be managed as students struggle with making meaning in a new language. Very, very, very face threatening to be infantilized all over again. Particularly if an adult, who was it who said, in order to become a wit in a foreign language, you have to become a half-wit first. And a lot of people are not happy being construed as a half-wit. And so, hence the notion of the affective filter, which we associate with Stephen Krashen, and again, kind of timed very much with the advent of humanistic learning psychology, particularly in the United States at the time. So the idea, of course, was the affective filter acted as a block to the acquisition of language through comprehensible input. And if you take the filter away, then everything is in the garden is rosy kind of thing. You just learn language by understanding messages. But the Bloch argued Krashen to that, and this is his argument is based on first language acquisition, that children seem to be not anxious when they're learning or acquiring their first language. But maybe not. But that's his argument. The affective filter comes crashing down around about pubescence, and it's our job in the class, therefore, to remove it by whatever means. And of course, we've got all sorts of techniques that were generated out of humanistic learning psychology, and to reduce the affective filter. I'm thinking of the title of the book that was very popular at the time, called Caring and Sharing in a Foreign Language Classroom. And that sort of captures, I think, the notion that the one way of reducing the affective filter was creating a harmonious, non-threatening, stress-free classroom dynamic. And we got a number of methodologies that are associated with that. I'll come to it in a minute. But one of them, well, I won't actually, that's in the other talk. I'll mention it now then, was Suggestopedia. Do you remember that one? Where you are lulled into a state, an infantilized, very suggestive state, through the playing of soft music, through comfortable furniture, and through the beautifully modulated voice of the teacher as she read you dialogues in Bulgarian or whatever it is that you were supposed to be studying. I say Bulgarian because it was associated, with, of course, with Lozanov, who was a Bulgarian. And yeah, so that was very much kind of the flavor of the time, to reduce the affective filter through activities, not necessarily fun activities, but certainly activities which were not stressful in any way. Another way of reducing inhibition, of course, is through measured amounts of alcohol. And whoops, I say this advisedly after lunch, but another set of studies, this was done, famous studies by Giora et al. Learners were administered quantities of alcohol and Valium in order to reduce, this is for real science, to reduce the level of inhibition. And I think this is significant. Alcohol resulted in better pronunciation. Up to a point, and then you start to slur your words. But Valium did not. So a result that has interesting possibility for application in language teaching, says Rod Ellis, one of the few exclamation marks in his whole 1,000-word book. This is Rod being funny. So a lot of us come from that tradition, and I think are sympathetic to the tradition that, you know, the classroom should be as stress-free as possible for all these reasons I've mentioned. More recently, well, not that more recently, but in fact, Nick Robinson referenced this morning on his plenary, the work of the psychologist, Csikszentmihalyi, yes, exactly. Well, I was talking to Paul about this earlier, and this guy would be much better known if his name was more pronounceable. But he never gets mentioned at conferences because people have had too much to drink, can't pronounce it. He was the one, if you remember this morning, if you were there, who talked about the theory of flow. So he wrote a book, famously popular in its time, called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience. And just to revisit that, to give you a kind of visualization of what Nick was talking about this morning, the idea is that where you are challenged, but you have the requisite skills to meet the challenge, you will possibly experience optimal emotional, affective factors. You'll feel good about what you're doing. If, on the other hand, you are challenged, but you don't have the requisite skills, you will feel lots of negative stuff, anxiety, stress, etc. So this is what, you know, we what? And if on the reverse is that if you're not challenged, but you've got the skills to meet the challenge that you could be having, but you're not, you'll feel apathy or boredom, etc. And so famously watching television. Exhaustive studies have been done on people watching television for extended periods of time and find that they get very depressed, even if they're binge watching their favorite Netflix series. So you're not being challenged, basically. And so this kind of summarizes that view. There's the name for you. And he describes enjoyment as a key component of flow experiences. Flow is characterized as a sweet spot in optimally challenging activities where one is neither feeling overwhelmed nor under challenged. I mean, he's talking about all sorts of things here, just to go back here. I mean, he interviewed people exhaustively and asked them, when did you feel most satisfied, content, happy? When did you feel completely immersed in experience? And a lot of people talked about hobbies and things they do and rock climbing and things, but a lot of things were not that mind-shattering. I mean, they were kind of like rather mundane activities, but they happened to give that particular person just a sense of flow. They got completely absorbed in the activity to the extent that they kind of, that famous sensation of feeling time, not being aware of time passing. And they, oh God, stop doing that. And another way of visualizing that, the same thing, is these breaks it down into the different parameters or the different segments of emotional reaction. So high anxiety, where the challenge is high but the skills are low. On the other hand, way down here, you've got boredom, apathy, and relaxation. Now, you could equally argue, and I will be arguing, that you could use this model to argue for upping the challenge and hence not having classes which are all kind of touchy-feely and everything's going very smoothly. In other words, that may lead to a state of relaxation which is not conducive to learning, which is the point that Sarah was making this morning, and I will come back to that after the break. On the other hand, there does seem to be a correlation between enjoyment and flow, such that in a very recent, oh no, not so recent paper, this person said, in his framework, play and flow appear to be mutually constitutive. In other words, the notion of play enters in the picture here, that a lot of these activities that people described, if not games or sports, but there was a ludic element, a play element in them, and that play is often, and flow often, support each other, they constitute each other. And that's what I really want to kind of home in on, this notion of play equating with flow, not necessarily fun, but of course play involves, one way or the other, some degree of fun, however we define fun. And I'm not going to attempt to define fun, but I do want to talk about play. Everybody plays. Play is a universal human behavior. Children play, animals play, so I mean, it goes even beyond our own species. And it seems to be an important component of learning. And so people cognitive psychologists, developmental psychologists like Vygotsky, who've studied play, believe that play creates that magical zone of proximate development. It pushes the child into an area where peak learning is possible. And play, and I like this, a child always behaves beyond his or her average age, above his or her daily behavior, and played as though he was a head taller than himself. So it pushes you to do things which you would not risk doing in real life, to take those kind of risks, because it is, after all, it's just play, and it's generally play with other people who can, siblings, parents, whatever, who can support you if you fall, literally and metaphorically. And of course you get that very much, it's very much documented in studies of first language acquisition, that children play with words endlessly, and with them to themselves or with another child, and get enormous enjoyment out of constantly doing these funny little routines, which are sort of meaningless, but they can go on and on and on. And those of you who have children, have any children, will be familiar with things like this. Toby, and I don't know what age they were. You silly, no, Toby silly. You silly, no, you silly. No, not you silly, you silly. No, not, no silly, no silly. This goes on for pages. And I think you may well have seen there's that YouTube thing that's virtually viral now, and it was shown at a conference recently, at IATEFL conference the year before last, of these two kids who pre-linguistically are having a conversation using intonation only. And it's absolutely amazing. Twins, aren't they? Yeah. So they've kind of created this intonational language, and it's completely and utterly, you know, plausible that they are communicating, and they're laughing themselves sick. And that's a similar kind of sequence, pre-linguistic. So play is there sort of almost innately, and then we see it in second language acquisition as well. One of my favorite studies, I've talked about it endlessly, the playground study done in the States in the 1970s of showing how immigrant children from Mexico were integrated into English-speaking school communities through playground activities, through attaching themselves to a group. And the subjects of this study was called in the study Nora, and Nora had her own, was clearly a very astute and motivated and autonomous language learner, and she also played with language. So she would take a sentence and sort of run it through, would verbalize it repeatedly. So this is, she said me that it were not true raining by she house. She said it were not true raining by she house. She said she not raining by she house. And then, so she's basically drilling herself in a pattern which is not 100% correct, but she gets there. And this is, again, seems to be an important learning procedure. As I say, both for first and second language acquisition. And this has led some writers recently to query the kind of current utilitarian view of language learning, that in other words we're learning second languages because they have some particular functional purpose. Functional, that's related to the communicative approach, for example, that you're learning language for special purposes, that you're learning language to be able to do something, and that the best way of learning a language, therefore, is to do tasks which simulate or replicate those kind of outcomes. Yeah? So you want to talk about your business, therefore we'll do some work on class on talking about and describing your business, and we'll do role plays, and you'll stand up and present your business and all that kind of thing. These are tasks, a task-based instruction. When you think about the word task, think about it for a second. Task sounds like not the sort of thing I would like to be doing on a Saturday afternoon. It sounds like work. Yeah? It sounds like a job to do, and it's synonymous, of course, with job, chore. We don't talk about chore-based learning, but we could. Writing shopping lists. So this led some people, like Guy Cook, as I say, to kind of question this fundamental belief built into the communicative approach and task-based learning that language learning is all about achieving day-to-day functions or work functions or study functions or whatever. He says that actually, no, there's a vast amount of language use in real life which is it's not functional, it's actually quite playful. And so he kind of tried to steer things back towards let's think about language as play. So this is Guy Cook in his book, Language Play, Language Learning. And he criticizes communicative language teaching for being just as selective with the uses and functions of language as traditional syllabuses were with structures. In other words, they choose only those functions of language which are kind of utilitarian, which have a kind of a vocational or academic outcome. And in particular, CLT, communicative language teaching, neglected those pleasurable, emotive, and controversial aspects of social interaction which are expressed through the genres of play. So, and he would include in those genres, because literary genres, of course, literature is all about expression rather than functionality. It's like it's in a sense, in a lot of literature, particularly poetry, plays with language. But not just literary genres. We constantly play word games. We constantly play, make puns, etc., and joke about words, the forms of words. We are amused by things like rhyming slang, for example. And these, again, seem to be universal characteristics of human linguistic behavior. We like things that rhyme. We like patterns. We like regularities. We like repetition. So this is what he's saying. Maybe we need, the pendulum maybe needs to swing a little bit back towards play, the ludic kind of functions of language, the expressive functions, the poetic functions of language. And of course you see this when you give students a little inch of rope. Is that the word? You give them a little, take them off the tight rein, and they'll play with language in ways which are kind of refreshing and original and creative. And that, again, that's another key word, the creative use of language is all part of this broader play function. So this is, for example, these are students, I don't know, one of my favorite warm-up activities in the class is that what I call paper conversations, where students just have conversations and they pass, and it's like texting, they pass the paper backwards and forwards and ask each other about the weekend. So they're not speaking, but they're writing in real time. A colleague of mine adapted that idea with a teens class and used it for doing role play. So this is a role play between, forgive me if you've seen it before, but a role play between a mother and her son. And I'll have to read it to you. Mum, says the son, I want to ask you something. What is the question? So they're passing this paper backwards and forwards and writing this in real time. I want to get a tattoo. You can do what you want, says another. Okay, what? I'm going to get a tattoo. With one condition, says Mum, but it has to say, I love Mum. Are you crazy? Like you, I want another mother. Okay. So they're kind of riffing on, this is happening virtually in real time. It's slowed down because they're writing, but it's just marvelous, these little moments of kind of inventiveness and creativity that teenagers, particularly, but all ages, can introduce into activities which are probably rather mundane. So this is the kind of thing that Guy Cook's talking about, and I guess I'm talking about when I talk about play as a kind of a way of having fun in the classroom. These kids are having fun, they're doing it creatively with language, and at the same time they probably are pushing themselves into the zone of proximal development. In other words, they are taking risks with language which they might not normally do from speaking, but also outside the classroom. Another study done in Hong Kong, again with teenagers in a school context, showed similar things. So when students were asked to do a dialogue, I think they had to do a dialogue. They had to pretend to be, for some reason, the president of China meeting Bill Clinton. This was in the days when Clinton was the president of the United States. So it was an imaginary situation. But because of Bill Clinton's associations with Bill Clinton and various scandals, these kids turned this whole thing into a thing full of sexual innuendo. And I'm not even going to put out the transcript. But the researchers said this is a kind of carnival thing. You know, carnival, the idea that for one day of the year or 1 week of the year, everything, all the gloves are off, there's no rules anymore, and men dress as women and women dress as men, and people misbehave and so on. And this notion of carnival, of course, has been picked up by some writers and philosophers, not least Bakhtin. I'm not going to quote Bakhtin, but this comes from a book of research studies based on his kind of thinking. And they say, Lin and Look say, these students managed to have a carnival type of laughter through creating indecent English dialogues within the school walls. Through populating the English language, their own local social languages and voices, they've appropriated English for their own purposes. They've kind of made English momentarily their own by being a little bit naughty with it. And again, I kind of like the idea that this is going on all the time in classrooms, that there's this subversive carnival element where people are playing with language, essentially, and playing with a second language, which is an achievement. So just to kind of sum up on language play, Again, it's become, there's quite a few papers coming out, or have come out in the last few years, looking at examples just exactly like this, and making this kind of conclusion, that language play has an important role in the development of learners' identities, multi-competent selves, and communicative repertoires, just as language play in the first language allows learners, children, to grow taller through play. The same thing happens in the second language. And another study has itemized in particular what these at least three benefits of playful talk are. It allows learners to experiment with a wider range of voices. They can pretend to be President Clinton if they want. They can pretend to be the mother in the tattoo thing. And thereby they stretch their socio-linguistic competence. They've got to think, well, how would this person actually greet the President of China? So on. Even when you're being obscene. Play offers learners the opportunity to implement a wider range of social language functions, so it's not just the roles and voices, but the different kinds of functions, including functions which are not normally taught, perhaps, or not in syllabuses, functional syllabuses, things like assessing, well, complaining, critiquing, chastising, and we saw mention of and teasing, for example, banter, and that kind of thing happens a lot in classrooms where the right dynamic prevails. And also, of course, play allows learners to do conversation. On that last note, play offers opportunities for speaking, for fluency development, for conversation. One thing, of course, when we talk about play, we can think also of the countable noun, a play, and think of theatre and drama activities in the classroom. And they are, in a sense, a kind of play, because you are dressing up, you are changing your role, you're having the opportunity to experiment with different roles, different functions, etc., through drama activities. I'm thinking of the more formal drama activities, not just role plays and simulations, which students actually write, rehearse, and present a little sketch and maybe film it and share it with other classes. And just as a final note on that, there's a nice study in TESOL Quarterly, very recently in fact, which compared a communicative language class, or two communicative language classes, so in other words they were doing communicative language teaching, they were doing lots of speaking activities, with two classes which were the same in a sense, they were communicative, but they also were doing drama activities within, so it's not more exposure, it's the same amount of exposure theoretically in terms of classroom time, but it was one of the experimental group was doing a lot of drama activities, and I thought, and it's a nice study because it's done with about 40 students over a period of time, and the results of the study suggest that drama activities can have a significant impact on oral fluency. So there was a difference, even compared to students who were already doing communicative language activities, the drama actually made even more significant difference. And then finally, moreover, the drama techniques employed in our study appear to help learners develop strategies that are generalizable to a variety of, so it's not just that they got good at doing drama, they're able to generalize this oral fluency to different speaking tasks. So I think that's kind of good news. We know that. I think we sense it intuitively that, yeah, drama activities are great, but now there's evidence coming through. So, play, fun, play with language. Guy Cook, just to close, says, and I think I like this is at the very end of his book, he said, a person who can play with a language in creative and socially effective ways, for example, to tell a joke or a story, could certainly also buy an airline ticket. The reverse, however, is not necessarily true. So thank you, that's it, and laugh and be merry. Go forth laughing. I don't think we have time for questions. There is another session after the break, or after a long break, where I'll look at the other side of the argument. So I'm not going to address that now, if you want to ask a question or two, but we've got a minute, Tracy says.
It sounded like you were saying task-based learning is anti-fun, but I think aren't a lot of task-based learning activities in game format, when you are doing a game that involves performing a task, so
yeah.
They overlap.
They do indeed overlap, and that's a very good point. So tasks needn't be a task, it could be a game, yeah, so it could be a role play, it could be a simulation, it could be designing a sketch, etc. So we need to stretch the meaning of task. I think what Guy Cook is saying, that task was perhaps an unhelpful word because it makes people think that these are purely, as I say, utilitarian kind of uses of language. But you're absolutely right, it could be composing a song and performing it. That would be a task, absolutely. Good point. Yes, Paul?
This is a question for later, but I'll leave with it now. I think there's a tendency to sort of talk about fun, play and engagement as if fun is one thing, play is one thing. It's quite hard to sort of disentangle. You know, what is the difference between fun and play and engagement? How do they sort of all work together? Exactly.
So I would pick up on Sarah's point this morning that maybe fun is an outcome of play and engagement, but it's not necessarily the starting point. But I didn't want to get into that because I thought Sarah dealt with it so well. But you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things, the kind of the elephant in the room at this conference is what is fun and who's defining and how we define. So that's why I kind of steer the discussion away from fun in itself and look more at play.
Because with play there's a tension between work and play, as you mentioned, and in the context of education, you don't have that freedom of open, free, imaginative play because you've got assessments to worry about, you've got objectives, learning things. And there's quite tension there. I think it's quite hard to resolve it. Well,
this is why I think even within a kind of very strict curriculum, where it's kind of nice when little bits of creativity bubble up, and that we need to be prepared for that and perhaps encourage it. But yeah, okay, fine. Time to get out of here. It's getting a bit hot. Thank you very much for your